Hello, my name's Rod Moffat. I'm here in Bancroft, Ontario, and I'm considering sponsoring a refugee through the private sponsorship program, but I have a few questions about it. So I'm here to ask Stephen Watt about those questions.
And I'm Stephen Watt. As you mentioned, I have an organization called Northern Lights Canada, which exists to facilitate private sponsorship. But it's all volunteer run. It's very unofficial. So I'm just here speaking from my own experience, and I'm thankful to be here.
Very good. So my first question, if I sponsor a refugee, does it cost money?
It doesn't cost the sponsor, money necessarily. You can contribute if you want. But you don't have to. A lot of times the funding that the government requires to be in the bank before you submit the application, it can come from anywhere really except from the refugee themselves. So a lot of times funds come from family, friends, crowdfunding. It definitely does not have to come from the sponsors, and typically doesn't come from the sponsor. It's not a financial commitment you're making. It's more of an ethical commitment to help somebody settle in Canada once they arrive.
Okay. What do I need to do to sponsor a refugee?
First of all, you have to make sure that the refugee is eligible for the program, and that means with a group of five sponsorship. They have to have a refugee document, usually from the UNHCR, which is a United Nations body. They get a card saying they're refugees. Sometimes it comes from other countries, but they have to have that. So number one, they have to be eligible. If they are eligible, then there's some paperwork to fill out. You have to set up a trust account, and the trust account is where the money goes. That is the money that the refugee lives on when they come here for their first year. So it's not, it has to sit untouched until the refugee comes, and then you as the sponsor sort of hand it over in allotments for the person to live on. So the bank is one, the paperwork is another. The paperwork you have to fill in, and they have to fill in. And then ideally somebody will check the application, make sure it's ready to go. Usually me, packaged together in this sort of application, and then you mail that off to immigration.
Very good. Now, what are my responsibilities when the refugee arrives in Canada?
As part of the settlement plan, which you write up, it's part of the application, you have your five core group members, which we call group of five, and you sort of define amongst yourselves how you want to divide up the settlement responsibilities. So you sort of, some people might have daytime availability, some people don't. Some people might have expertise in banking or accounting, other people don't. So you sort of figure that out early when you're actually writing the application, and then you just sort of help the person settle. So it's just like if you had a cousin, coming from England, what would that involve, right? It would involve going to a bank, setting up a bank account, applying for various Canadian documents. That's what's involved. One interesting thing to know, though, is that, it's a long wait period. So some people move, some people get divorced, some people have life decisions. You're not actually held by the government, like feet to the fire, to do what you said you would do. That's why it's a group of five. So if one person is unavailable for whatever reason, there are others to pick up the slack. It's more of a kind of notional commitment to do A, B, C, and D when they arrive. And yeah, it's settlement. It's settlement for the first year. That's the sort of term of the commitment. But, often people stay very connected with the refugee for years. It can be a lifelong relationship, to be honest.
Okay. Am I responsible for the education of the refugee?
It's up to the person arriving whether they want to pursue education in Canada or not. I usually advise that they do, but often people are so hungry to work when they get here, because often they're not allowed to work in the countries where they've been a refugee. They just, I want to work, I want to make money. There's a lot of sort of pent up energy. So it's often difficult to convince them to go to school, but ideally they do. Now, that's not your job as a sponsor to sort of give them an education. They would apply for a school program like anybody else. But yeah, I think it's a good just general practice to encourage people to improve their English, get a Canadian degree, maybe brush up on some skill. I would advise that, but it's ultimately up to the refugee.
Okay.
Yeah.
And will I be responsible for refugees' financial needs after they arrive?
Yeah, it's a really important point because one of the things that holds some people back from private sponsorship is they get it confused with other kinds of immigration. Like if you were to apply for your parents, you might be on the hook financially, for 20 years. This is not that program. The reason why the government requires you to have money sitting in a trust account is to cover their financial needs for their first year. And that is it. There's nobody comes after you as a sponsor. You don't even have to be employed. The money that they live on is the money in the trust account.
And will I be responsible for the refugees' legal needs once they're in Canada?
Definitely not. The most amazing thing about this program, unlike every other country's program, is that the people when they come are not refugees. They're permanent residents. They actually get their permanent resident paper in the airport. So the moment they set foot on Canadian soil, they are permanent residents. So refugee days are over. And that's a wonderful benefit for somebody who's been stateless or displaced for years, just knowing they already belong to Canada. And from a legal perspective, it means that they are treated as permanent residents by Canada.
And what information about myself will I need to submit to be a part of a group of 5 sponsors?
Sure. So when you fill out the application, there's a settlement plan where you declare sort of who will do what in your sponsor team. Provide a piece of ID establishing that you're either a permanent resident or citizen of Canada, and something called a sponsor assessment. So it's actually not that onerous, to be honest. Do you think? Yeah.
And if I don't provide the money for the refugee sponsorship budget, who does?
That money can come from anywhere except from the refugee. So often it's friends and family. They might have a cousin in Australia who's doing well financially, or maybe they have somebody's got money in any country, really. You just have to make sure that you keep track of where the money came from.
Who can be eligible for being part of a group of 5?
So the group of 5 is, there's different ways of sponsoring refugees. There's, community sponsor, group of 5, sponsorship agreement holder. The one that I'm involved in most of the time is group of 5. And the group of 5 means 5 people who are over the age of 18. They live in the same community. They don't live in Quebec. Quebec has its own program, so that we're talking about everywhere Quebec. And they have to be either permanent residents or citizens of Canada.
Does the refugee, when they arrive, have to live in my house?
Definitely not. If you like them to live in your house, for sure. But yeah, no, they don't. The one thing that you do have to think about is, so one of the, I would say the toughest part of settlement is, especially in Toronto where I live, is finding an apartment. I mean, it's not that hard, but if you have a family, it can be hard to find good, affordable housing. So you do have to have a plan of where they stay until you found that housing.
Thank you so much for joining me today and for answering my question. It's really been helpful.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for our folks for having me.